Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Dasha in West Palm Beach, Florida, and White House correspondent Gilchrist, who is in Philadelphia. Dasha, I want to start with you. Trump and his allies are blaming these assassination attempts on Democratic rhetoric. But what do we know actually about the gunman's political convictions and his motivations here?
Well, look, we know, Yamiche, that he was a disaffected Trump supporter, that he went overseas to Ukraine, that he was someone who was not necessarily motivated by the former president's current claims. And I'll say, Yamiche, that in recent days, the Trump campaign sent out an email with a long list of quotes from Vice President Harris, from President Biden, from other Democrats, with that phrase, threat to democracy, referencing former President Trump. That was a deliberate campaign strategy for the Trump campaign to actually adopt that language and start using it, as you played in that mashup of clips there. So that is a phrase that has now become used by both sides of the aisle to point the finger at the other, not really limited to the Harris campaign or the Trump campaign or even just the presidential election right now, Yamiche.
Yeah, and as you talk about that, there's also this idea that the motivations of the gunman in Butler, Pennsylvania shooting were unclear in the aftermath of that. But Trump and his allies back then called for unity, at least for a few days before blaming Democrats. Why is Trump and the Trump campaign approaching this assassination attempt so differently? Is the campaign simply in a different place right now?
Yeah, Yamiche, it's a very different tone from what we heard in the aftermath of what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, that first assassination attempt. There was, at least for a temporary period, a more reflective tone from the former president. Those calls for unity, that didn't happen at all, not even for a moment this time around. The finger pointing happened right afterwards. I don't know if that's so much because of where the campaign itself is at or where it is that the former president himself is at. The campaign takes the direction of the boss, of the guy at the top, and that is former President Trump. And his tone since what happened in Butler has gotten angrier and more frustrated, especially after the change at the top of the Democratic ticket. And that has continued to ramp up. And now we have the second incident, which understandably is frightening and frustrating for someone to go through. And now we see him take this different approach now the second time around, Yamiche.
Yeah, and what's also important to note is that Senator J.D. Vance also addressed this apparent assassination attempt on the campaign trail. What did we hear from the senator today?
Well, Senator J.D. Vance, the former president's running mate, continued to make those claims that it is the rhetoric on the left that is causing this to happen. He has also pointed out that there haven't been, at least that we know of, assassination attempts on Vice President Kamala Harris. Elon Musk, who has been one of the influential advisors for former President Trump, tweeted a joke about that was quickly deleted. But this is the response and the reaction that we're hearing from the former president and from his allies, Yamiche.
Yeah. I also want to talk to you. We played some of the vice president's comments, Aaron, at the top of this. What else is the campaign saying about this apparent assassination attempt?
Isn't really saying anything about this attempted assassination, this apparent attempted assassination. And I think everything that we've heard to this point has come from Vice President Harris herself. We knew that she called the former president this afternoon. We got that from the White House as opposed to getting it from the campaign. And so the extent of what we've heard really has been in the statements from President Biden, the statements from Vice President Harris, saying that they're happy that the former president is okay and that they really want to see an effort made to tone down some of the rhetoric and try to cut off political violence before it becomes even more dangerous in these last, 49 days until the election. And so at this point, we got that reiteration, really, I think, from the vice president in this panel discussion she did today with the National Association of Black Journalists, that she doesn't want to see anybody hurt, that she doesn't believe political violence is the way to solve anything, and that she would like to see everybody sort of take a beat and do what they can individually and collectively as sort of the political universe that we have right now to tone things down and to cool things off.
That's right. We did hear all that. And Aaron, we also heard, though, from the vice president at this NABJ event, be very critical of former President Trump's rhetoric when it comes to the lies about Springfield, Ohio, and the Haitian immigrant population there. What did she say there?
Well, we heard the vice president say that it's a crying shame what's going on in Springfield, Ohio, what's happening to the people in that community. And I know that phrase, when I grew up, had multiple meanings, an expression of sadness, but also an expression of disdain or disgust for what is happening. And the vice president said that there's a need to really understand how much your words have meaning. She talked about entering the political sphere, understanding that her words had meaning when she was the Attorney General of California. That she said that sometimes she knew that the words she would use could move markets. And so she's encouraging people on the other side of this campaign season to think about the words that they say and what they mean and how people might receive them before they say them. And that was something that she didn't name Donald Trump or J.D. Vance outright during the course of that 45-minute or so interview that she did this afternoon, but she was clearly directing that message at them and their surrogates, Yamiche.
Yeah, and she was very passionate in describing us. We hadn't really heard a lot from her on that subject, so it was an interesting and striking exchange there. So thank you so much, Dasha and Aaron. And joining me now is Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent at the New York Times and an NBC News political analyst, and Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She's a professor and expert on political violence at American University. Thank you both for being here. Peter, I want to start with you. Former President Trump has now faced 2 apparent assassination attempts. It's sort of mind-boggling to say that out loud, but that's where we are now. And you wrote about the normalization of political violence in your latest piece. So, Peter, how in the world did we get here?
Yeah, that's a good question. And look, I mean, political violence is not new in America. Obviously, there have been periods in our history where we've gone through some pretty rough times. 4 of our presidents have been assassinated. Another was shot and wounded deeply. So, you know, it's not necessarily unique, but we haven't seen something like this in a while, where we have a presidential candidate, a former president of the United States, targeted twice within 2 months. And I think it says something. It was coming also just days after those bomb threats in Ohio that seemed to stem from the former president's, false accusations about eating pets and so forth. 33 bomb threats in Springfield, Ohio, just in the course of a couple of days, targeting schools and public buildings, forcing children to be evacuated. So what we see today, I think, is political violence increasingly part of our landscape. It's something we've come to expect, even if we don't think it's the right thing. It's no longer shocking. I mean, the conversation pretty quickly went back to the regular campaign within hours of this event on Sunday without any sort of, national soul searching or reckoning about our politics. And instead, it became, of course, one more tool for attacking the other side. Trump busy complaining about Democratic rhetoric, targeting him at the same time he's calling the Democrats, literally in the same interview, the enemy within, who are destroying the country, which sounds a lot like the kind of rhetoric he's complaining about from their side. So it's a really a fraught moment in our politics, and we're going to be lucky, I think, if we get to the election without anything else happening.
Yeah, it's a critically important point to make that Trump has sort of been part of this. Now, Cynthia, back in July, after the first assassination attempt, you wrote in the Financial Times that the shooting is a, quote, reckoning both for political leaders and for ordinary Americans. It's a moment in which everyone should think about the role they play in escalating the potential for violence. Is our country in a place to have that conversation? And I wonder, do you really think that reckoning happened given where we are now?
Well, I agree with Peter. I don't think the reckoning has really happened. I think what we have seen is a real normalization of the political violence, the language around it. And what I was talking about in July, I was seeing among my own friends on social media feeds, language like, we had it coming, you reap what you sow. And I think that kind of language is dangerous, right? I think it's dangerous when people overhear it in the coffee shop or around the dinner table. No matter what your political opinions are or where you stand, to kind of legitimize the use of violence against a political opponent is dangerous. And we're seeing that even with language among other Republican officials yesterday, like evil, right? Enemy. Those types of words, I think, are just feed into this idea that there's an existential threat and that it would be heroic even, some think, to meet it with violence.
Yeah. And Peter, I want to jump on what that point Cynthia was just making about sort of a national reckoning. I wonder what you think that would look like and how our country could actually have a reckoning like that.
I'm not sure what it would look like because I'm not sure we can have it anymore, at least at this moment. We're so polarized. We're in such a tribal moment in our country that you hear people, as we just talked about, you know, even cheering or lamenting that an attempt wasn't successful, even if they weren't serious, even if it was a joke, a bad joke, a macabre joke. That's obviously something that's pretty, you know, out of the ordinary. At least it used to be out of the ordinary. And I can't see how we have that conversation where we're able to reach across the aisle to talk to each other about how to conduct our politics without this sort of thing. And it's always going to be, especially in the heat of this campaign, just 50 days away, less than 50 days away. It's going to be just seen in the light of that contest, and maybe afterwards there's a different way of having this conversation. But it doesn't seem like the political environment is conducive to that right now.
Yeah. And as we think about the political environment, I want to play for you, Peter, what Florida Governor Ron DeSantis said about this latest apparent attempt on Donald Trump's life yesterday. Take a listen.
There's a lot of people in our society who may have a screw loose. And if you're constantly telling them that American democracy is going to end if this guy gets elected president, well, somebody is going to feel that they're justified for doing this. The apocalyptic rhetoric has increased the threats to Donald Trump.
So, Peter, what do you make of what the governor is saying and how Republicans are talking about this in this moment?
Well, I think he would have more of a case to make if he talked about his own side as well, right? Because apocalyptic rhetoric is actually the stock and trade of Donald Trump. I mean, he talks about this being a country that won't have a country anymore, he says. They're destroying the country, he says. He says that, you know, Kamala Harris, he talks, you know, complains about being called a fascist, and he calls her a fascist. Remember, he has time and time again encouraged openly violence, whether it be at his own rallies where he says, hey, if there are some hecklers, go ahead and beat them up, or whether it be talking about a general who, you know, he found disloyal should be put to death, or in fact, of course, obviously January 6th, when he gave that speech riling up a crowd, even if he shouldn't be blamed for that speech, even if he didn't mean for the attack on the Capitol to happen, he didn't act very quickly to stop it either. And in fact, since then has embraced the people who beat police officers and chanted "Hang Mike Pence" and said he would give them pardons. So if you had both sides having an honest conversation here, maybe that would be one thing. But all you're seeing right now is you know, an effort to say, well, the other side's doing it without reckoning with what you know, is happening, particularly on Donald Trump's side.
Yeah, and sort of what Peter is talking about, Cynthia, is sort of the future of this. You study, of course, polarization and extremism. Are we thinking that we're in a new era here of political violence? Do you foresee a sort of normalization of the political violence going forward, the future of our country? I'm asking you about, Cynthia.
Yeah, I think, you know, what Peter said about not being able to put the genie back in the bottle is definitely true. I mean, we have crossed a line, I think, a threshold in which this has become much more normalized. But I will say sort of two things about that. One, what we heard DeSantis say right there about this guy having a screw loose. I think that's really important to point out that we're much more likely to attribute mental health problems to white shooters than we are to other shooters who we assume have ideological motives. We don't know yet what this guy wanted or what his actual motivation was, but we do know that he had a history of wanting a sense of meaning and purpose and recognition and heroism. And so I think some of the things that communities can do to prevent this is not just about toning down the rhetoric, but paying attention to people around them. Are they slipping through the cracks? Are they feeling like they have a place where they belong? Do they have something that's bigger and better than themselves? And I think that kind of thing can go a long way toward preventing an individual toward moving to violence because they think they're going to get some sort of heroic recognition from it, whether or not it's ideological.
Yeah. And Cynthia, I want to also ask you this. Do you think we can trace all this back to just 2016 and the Trump era? Or does this come, and I wonder how this compares to other past political periods. I'm thinking of 1968 and that, of course, tumultuous year.
We definitely have had these periods of political violence and political assassinations before, particularly in the 1960s is what I'm thinking about, like what you mentioned. In the data, what we see is that the uptick in hate-fueled attacks and hate-fueled violence, which is also closely connected to political violence, starts after President Obama was elected. That's when you start to see this real us versus them polarization creep up. We see populist rhetoric around the world creep up. a sense that there's an existential threat from the other, and that then it's ultimately okay to meet it with violence. So I would trace this back another decade prior to that, but it really started to tick up in 2016, and we've seen the effects of that.
Yeah. Of course, interesting that you bring up Barack Obama, as we might be seeing a President Harris who might, of course, be the first Black woman and maybe even add to that rhetoric in that division. So thank you both, Peter and Cynthia, for your time.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.